Who Gets to Decide? A liberty-based podcast that brings a little piece of sanity to a confused society drowning in a culture of craziness. And here is your host, Seth Martin.
Well, all right. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Who Gets to Decide. This is episode 618. I'm Seth Martin, your host. Thank you for joining me this evening. Glad you're here and always happy you're listening. You've heard me talk about this conflict between the United States and China. And I watched a really good video the other day on it by a guy named Tom Bilyeu. And I've got some clips from his program. Now, we're not going to play the whole thing. I encourage you to go watch the whole thing. It's really good. But we've talked about freedom and how our culture is different. You know, we have this tradition of freedom and liberty and how this kind of drives innovation and property rights and all these things kind of meld into the American experience, our standard of living, what we've been able to contribute to the world, our level of production, things like this. And Tom kind of has a talk along those same lines, and I thought it was pretty good, and I wanted to expose the group to it here. It's a little bit different than my take, but close enough, and I just want to point out some subtleties. But the bigger point is some of these things that we have going on in America, where it's the financialization of America, fiat money printing, globalization, these things are not working for America, right? And people are starting to notice. Guys like me have been talking about this for years, but now normies are starting to notice. And once normies start to notice these things is when you get political change. And political change is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be bad if it's not in the right direction, or if it's not the right the right principles undergirding that political change. For example, right now we have populism. And to some degree, populism needs to exist in order to break the back of kind of the establishment. And so that's what you're seeing right now, I think. But eventually what you're going to see is you're going to see populism will hopefully at some point will meld into a different type of political structure that'll lead to real change, meaningful change. And like right now we're trying tariffs and we're trying all these things that really are not the problem. It's like it'd be like if somebody called a plumber and they came out and they went to your electrical box. Obviously they're not going to find the problem there. The problem is in the piping, not in the electrical wires or in the breaker. And so, you've heard me talk about this before, but if you want to solve a problem, you first have to identify a problem. Now this is very key to everything. Identification, all of reality starts with identification. This is something I learned years ago, not in college actually, or in engineering school, but while reading Atlas Shrugged. And I used to live next door to this guy. He had a business, and he said, "You ought to read Atlas Shrugged." And I said, "Really? Why is that?" And he goes, "It'll change your life." And I'm like, "Really? A book? Some fictional book's going to change my life?" It definitely changed my thinking on certain things. And there's these, if you've never listened to or read Atlas Shrugged, there's these long monologues where they're kind of imparting some underlying principle. And one of them is where he talks about reality begins with identity. A chair is a chair because we all agree that's a chair, that I'm sitting in a chair. And we call it a chair, and we all agree that that's the identity. We don't say Seth is not sitting on the floor. Seth is not sitting on a stool. We don't try to identify what I'm sitting on by talking about what it's not. We identify what I'm sitting on by talking about what it is. And so in the book, he talks about A is A. You can't say A is not B. That doesn't tell you what A is. And so this is kind of fundamental in our political system too. We don't think about it like this. Most people aren't geeked up like me and digging into this level of detail. they've got their busy lives and they don't spend any time thinking about this, which is perfectly normal, by the way. But what I'm bringing up is essential if we're going to redirect our political process in let's just call it the proper direction. And the proper direction would be toward property rights, liberty, free markets, and capitalism. These are the 4 things really that are key. Oh, and honest money. 5 things. These are 5 things that are really key to a vibrant, flourishing economy with happy people that have lots of opportunity, and every generation is living better than the previous generation. That's how you get all that. Growing up, we used to hear people say that, but nobody really ever talked about, well, how does that happen? What are the mechanics behind that? And that's it. It's honest money, it's property rights, it's liberty, it's free markets, and it's capitalism. Those 5 things are why when you hear Ronald Reagan talk about the next generation doing better than the previous generation, it's because those principles are intact. And what we've seen now, I would say since 2000, we've seen the opposite happen. We see life getting harder. We see the next generation not doing as well as the previous. And is it any surprise that we see attacks on property rights? We see regulation interference with capitalism and free markets. We see challenges to the money, the acceleration of the growth of the quantity of money. These are all things that are causing problems. But in order to really understand that, you have to identify what the problem is, okay? And when you're in the throes of populism, it's very difficult because there's a whole bunch of people that really don't understand the problem. But they get to vote, right? So they're voting for Donald Trump, or they're voting for somebody, their congressman they like because he's gotten stuff for us before, or whatever. Or they vote for the senator because they recognize his name because he's been in there for 40 years or something. But eventually that will give way to some sort of change. And what Tom Bilyeu is talking about in his video here is, now he's talking about it like it's a choice to come, like we haven't already started down this path. But in my view, we already have. And you'll see when I'll point it out when he brings this up. Excuse me. So anyway, let's jump into Tom's video here and start playing it.
On December 7th of 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, sending much of the U.S.'s naval fleet to the seafloor and killing thousands of Americans. The next day, the United States declared war. History would mark this infamous day as one of the starkest examples of f*** around and find out. Admiral Yamamoto is often quoted as saying, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether the quote is apocryphal or not, the statement is true. What the U.S. did next is unparalleled in human history. On a dime, we pointed our incredible industrial base single-mindedly to winning the war. What followed was industrial shock and awe. American industry produced nearly 100,000 tanks, 200,000 artillery pieces, and a staggering 300,000 aircraft. All of that was in addition to manufacturing nearly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. A feat of production so incredible that it buried the Axis powers and ensured none of us had to learn German or Japanese.
All right, let me stop right here for a second because it's important to point out that we were already very productive, okay? The difference is we were making consumer goods, right? We were making automobiles and, airplanes and things that consumers wanted to spend their money on. And so the productive capacity of the United States on the day that, on December 7th, 1941, was vast. I mean, you could just hear the numbers. We produced like 2/3 of the world's goods or something like that. So that is where the prosperity came from, okay? Now, what happened after the bombing of Pearl Harbor is the government came in and took control of the economy, okay? it came in and said, okay, we're going to have to direct all this productive capacity to winning the war. Okay. We don't want to speak German. We don't want to speak Japanese, right? So we want to win this war. But it's very important. Like I've heard people say World War II brought us out of the Great Depression. Really what brought us out of the Great Depression was this massive amount of productive capacity. Now, what happened was we were already kind of coming out of the Great Depression, right? But what happened is just think of it like this. The government basically confiscated all the industry and said, instead of making automobiles and toasters and refrigerators and airplanes and tractors and just name off all the, the many hundreds of things the economy was making, you're going to start making tanks, you're going to start making guns, you're going to start making aircraft, you're going to forget about refrigerators. Nobody could get people don't realize how much, like if you were a consumer back in the 40s and up and through, let's say 42 to 45, even 46 or 47, there were just no consumer goods. People just had to do without. That's what happened. And so the real economy, when I talk about real economy, I'm talking about an economy that serves consumers. And the reason that's important to make distinct is because consumers voluntarily spend their money. They take the money that they have in their pocket and they voluntarily hand it to somebody and buy a refrigerator or whatever. And this is important information because what this tells us, it tells us that if I'm buying the refrigerator, I value the refrigerator more than I value the money. And for the seller of the refrigerator, it's just the opposite. They value the money more than they value the refrigerator. So what happens is that's a win-win. Okay, there's a win-win that takes place there. Consumer activity in the economy is always a win-win. And the reason it's a win-win is because it's voluntary. But when you start putting the government on it and you say, well, we're going to build tanks and we're going to build this, and we're going to build that. And oh, by the way, you're not going to get refrigerators. You're not going to get automobiles. For years there, Ford just didn't, I don't know what the years were, but for several years there, they had no new models come out, right? And so this is, in some ways, is a phony economy. Okay, this is what I like to call a phony economy because there's no voluntarism in this. This is the government taking over the means of production. It's essentially socialism, and telling producers what they have to produce. You're not going to produce automobiles anymore. You're going to produce tanks. You're not going to produce, you're not going to produce aircraft that we can put people on and fly around. You're going to produce fighter aircraft, things like that. But it's important to note that the war didn't create that productive capacity. It was already there, okay? The government just came and seized it in effect. Now they seized it, they went to the owners of the factories and they said, we got to win the war. Can you help us do this? And they volunteered in that sense. But there's no consumer, the consumer was the government for all these things, the tanks and the firearms and the fighter planes and things like that. So that's what I want to point out. And so the key to that, and what he's going to talk about here more, is if that productive capacity, let's say in China, is directed at some sort of war effort. He's going to talk about competing empires here in a minute. We're on the losing side of that. Now, that's not going to keep us from fighting. We're still going to fight, okay? Because that's what governments do. But we're not likely to win that type of situation. England would, if England was standing alone in World War II, England would have lost. Okay. The only reason they won is because the United States came in. They were already much in decline. They were in World War II. They were where we are today. Okay. In major decline. So my point in bringing this up is we don't want to pick a fight with China. We don't want to run around and poke these guys in the eye. No, what we want to do is we want to trade with them. We want to continue to be able to give them dollars and have them send us real stuff that makes our life better. And so I think it remains to be seen whether all this tariff stuff is going to work, but that's another show. So we'll talk about that some other time. Let's continue here.
America proved we had the will to fight and the ability to outproduce anyone on the planet. We mobilized like a command economy briefly, and then we unwound it once we were again living free. And what did we do with that incredibly well-earned freedom? We went back to sleep. We globalized, we decayed, and we have fallen behind, way behind. If you look at the numbers, China now looks far more like the World War II era US than the US does. China is now the world's industrial superpower. They outproduce everyone. And because they're a top-down command economy, they can move far faster than the US with all of its political gridlock. But they're a dictatorship. Let that hang in the air while you think about this. Right now, the stakes are sky high. The US and China are on a collision course economically, politically, and militarily. They're stuck in a historical pattern known as Thucydides' trap. This is where you have a declining superpower going up against a rising superpower, and the last 16 times this has happened in history, the two nations have ended up going to war 12 times. Each side will do virtually anything to win. The question is, does that include the US becoming authoritarian? We've done it before, and right now the US is starting to make the same kind of policy decisions that China is famous for. Right now, today, the US government is no longer just giving companies tax incentives, they're buying them. That means politics, not performance, could soon decide which businesses win and which ones get wiped out. That's the same as deciding which investors win and which ones get wiped out. So the question we have to ask is, should America be taking a page out of China's playbook? And if we do, will the free market die? And will your investments be the next casualty? The answer to that question is anything but obvious. We're going to walk through the issue in 4 critical parts. Part 4 is my answer and what I think the right path forward is. But it will only make sense if you understand what's really going on right now between the US and China. So don't skip around. This one goes down straight, no chaser.
Okay. I mean, it's really hard to disagree with anything he's saying there. The only thing I would say is that China, like I said earlier, is where we were on the eve of World War II for the United States. December 7th, 1941. That's where they are, okay? They're a creditor nation. I don't know. They have quite a bit of debt. But they produce just everything, okay? And this is what led. The fact that look, after World War II, because we produced everything and we had all the gold, what happened? We had Bretton Woods. The whole world came here and said, you know what? We'll go off the gold standard because the United States has all the gold anyway, and we'll just trade dollars. The United States says dollars are as good as gold. We'll accept the dollar as a standard. They almost didn't have a choice. What is China doing today? They're buying a crap ton of gold, and they produce everything. So it's not rocket science to see where this is headed. Now, do we give up the free market system? Do we change who we are as a people? This is the fundamental question. And I would submit, see, he thinks that choice is ahead of us. And I would submit to you that we've already made that choice. We're already headed down that road. What we need to do is we need to roll back the direction in which we're headed. Now, I suspect that will happen, but it'll happen later after we recognize that populism didn't work, or, at least Donald Trump's style of populism and command and control didn't work. And maybe there's just a huge turnover in the government and maybe we make some choices. Or the other thing is maybe there's just a huge calamity. The financial system breaks down, what production we do have and global production starts to subside, and there just is a mad rush to come up with some other system, which I think would be bad for us. But the distinction I want to make between what I'm talking about and what Tom is talking about is I think we're already well down this road. We've already chosen command and control. We don't have a free market. And to the extent we have capitalism, it's crapitalism. Okay, it's connected people and companies that are connected to government that engage in market trading and things like that, but they do so in a way where they have an advantage or a privilege. Let's talk about it like a privilege. I've talked about this before. Like in the old days under mercantilism, you might get some sort of special right from the king to operate the only port. And if somebody came in and said, hey, I can do a better job, I'm going to operate the port, you just went and told the king that, hey, man, there's some guy trying to move in on my management of the port. And the king sent his soldiers and he got the guy and they chopped his head off. I mean, that problem solved. And this is mercantilism. So you can see that the person operating the port had a privilege, and they were privileged by the grace of the king. Okay. Well, we have the same thing. It's just they give money. Corporations give money to lobbyists and to Congress people, and Congress people vote in ways that help the corporations. But if you've ever run a company and you're out there hustling, and you're like, let's say you're running a $5 million company. Well, you don't have lobbyists. Okay. So you are trying to compete in the free market with other companies that have privilege. So in some ways, we've already given this command and control to the government. Okay. And what I'm saying is we need to roll it back. And the reason we need to roll it back is because, and the reason we need to roll it back sooner rather than later is because my belief is you can lose this. Okay. You can lose your sense of property rights, just everything, all the 5 things that we mentioned. We've already lost the money, but we're struggling because the money is the way it is. But you could also lose the free markets, property rights, capitalism, and I forgot what the other one was I mentioned. But those things can be lost or given way to more government encroachment. And when the government encroaches on those 5 things, what happens is it crowds out. It crowds out free enterprise. It crowds out individuals. And the only way that we're going to fix this is if we push that back and try to stuff that genie back in the bottle, which admittedly is difficult, but necessary. So let's continue with Tom here.
Welcome to part 1, the choice we have to make. As of 2023, China is responsible for roughly 29% of all global manufacturing value add. That's more than the next 4 countries combined, which includes the US. China makes over half of the world's steel, producing 76 million metric tons in December of last year alone, while the US clocked in at a measly 6.7 million metric tons for that same time period. As for shipbuilding, China controls over half of global commercial shipbuilding as well. The US is just 0.1%, a number so grotesque, most mainstream think tanks consider it a national security threat, which it is. During COVID, it became clear just how many things, like masks and pharmaceuticals, were controlled by China. And they control 70% of the rare earth minerals that power every phone, drone, and EV on Earth. If global competition were a foot race, China is sprinting while America argues over the rule book. China plans. Our politicians do and say whatever they need to get reelected. And right now, China is winning.
All right. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to see otherwise. You know, the fact is, Chinese people are very productive. Okay. They produce a lot. And they, you know, let's back up for just a second. What happened? Why did companies globalize? Part of it is the way the money is. When you can't accrue capital, and capital is not friendly. Like if you live in a society that's taxing a lot, and taxes on capital gains, taxes on income, things like that, and the dollar is such that it's losing its value, it makes a whole lot of sense to go. Let's say I got to build $1 billion factory, okay, I can build that $1 billion factory in the U.S. or I can build it in China, and let's say 30 years ago, you build that $1 billion factory in the U.S. What was happening 30 years ago? Unions had a stranglehold on labor. I mean, they just abused the companies that these people that they worked for. I mean, at one time, I think when a Suburban was like $35,000, something like $2,800 was just benefits for employees out of every Suburban. I mean, that's crazy. It's probably triple that now. And so people got soft and they thought that, oh, if I put wheels on a vehicle as it's rolling down the assembly line here, I should be getting paid $150,000 a year to do that. Meanwhile, the guy who's making a decision to build a plant knows that people in China will do that for $1 a day or whatever. And because they're producing so much, they have a lot of excess. So they're consuming what they have, but then they have all this excess so they can trade it away. And then more capital flows into their country. And this is just what was happening. And some of it was currency related. You know, the dollar, we went off the gold standard. Look, we went off the gold standard and capital fled America, right? Because what people saw was they saw the government spending out of control, creating a bunch of debt. And then we kind of started merging into this services and financial type of economy where we literally just, you know, I saw a graphic the other day where like the top 7 companies in the NASDAQ or like all these AI, you know, Amazon, you know, the Miracle 7 or the Miraculous 7 or whatever. It showed how these 7 or 8 companies, whatever it is, are just passing around $7 trillion among themselves. And all the other companies in the S&P 500, so 493 companies are fighting over the scraps. But these 7 or 8 companies are just, this $7 trillion is just moving among them. And that's insane, really. I mean, what is that? That's not a real economy, you know? And so this is kind of part of the problem in America, but does government take over the means of production in order to avoid some sort of head-on collision with China? No. What you do, that's the wrong way to go. What you have to do is you have to go the other direction. You have to say, no, the reason we're losing to China is because we don't have enough freedom. The thing about it is when you have a totalitarian system like China, they're not arguing. I saw something the other day where they built a bridge in like 30 days. In America, all these, you know, we can build a bridge in 30 days too, but you have to get all the stakeholders together and they have to agree. Okay. They have to sign contracts and agree. And what makes all that difficult now, it's, if you didn't have government, it wouldn't be difficult at all. But, you know, when you have environmental impact studies, you're having to deal with government. The EPA is there. Okay. So you can't just deal with the local residents or the local community. You're having to deal with this behemoth in Washington, D.C., and they want their pound of flesh. They want their money. Okay. Well, if I do that, if I vote for your deal, then I need this. You know, you need to put $250,000 in my campaign. And so then they haggle over all this stuff, and it takes so much time, and it takes so much money, and it's inefficient. And that's not really what China does. China just gets everybody together and says, the government's already decided that it's okay for the environment. The government's already decided that this 2 million people are just going to have to move. Okay. They show up with guns and they point them at you and say, get your ass off this land. This is what happened when they built the Three Gorges Dam. They moved out like 2.5 million people. Just told them to move. Didn't pay them any money or anything. Just relocated them. And so it's just not the way, that's not what a free society does, but it's a mistake to think in order to move fast, you need to have all this force. That's just not the case. America we built all kinds of things. You know, go to New York and look at Grand Central Station, look at the subway system, look at the catacomb system that brings water in from the Catskills into New York City. All that stuff was built really fast and with private money in most cases. And it was done because there wasn't a lot of government to get in the way. And so this is another thing I disagree with Tom on. You don't need more command and control. In fact, if you put more command and control on whatever little freedom we have left, it'll just muck things up even more. Things will even take longer. That's why you see these huge infrastructure projects or not projects, but money. Like they'll pass these huge infrastructure bills in Congress. And then 3 or 4 years later, you look around, there's no infrastructure. What the hell happened to all the money? Well, it just traded back and forth from all these interest groups and NGOs and environmental groups and things like that. Lawyers got paid. And so this is all because we don't respect property rights. We don't have enough freedom. We have too many regulations. We have capitalism. This is what causes all that. So this is where Tom and I depart a little, but I still think it's very valuable to listen to what Tom is talking about, because in some ways he's kind of predicting the future. What I'm describing is not likely to happen. What's more likely to happen is what he's describing. But what I'm trying to say is if we do that, we're not going to get China. We're not going to get China level production, okay? Because we're not China. Culturally, we don't have that do this. At some point, somebody's going to disagree. That's what happens in America. Well, I don't think it should be done that way, and it's my property. That's what happens in America. In China, they don't have that. They just point a gun at you and say, move or I'll shoot your ass. Because we don't have that, and we don't want that, by the way. I hope that's clear. But because we don't have that, we're never going to be able to do what China does in America in the same exact way. All right, let's continue.
Such is the power of a command economy. When you can marshal capital, labor, and infrastructure by fiat, you can move mountains. You can pick a goal on the horizon and just march everyone towards it. No shareholder votes, no focus group polling, no need to even build consensus. It's efficient, disciplined, and ruthless. And that's why China can build a bridge in a month while we spend a decade arguing over the environmental impact statement. When a top-down system works, it is breathtaking. But when it fails spectacularly.
Yes, this is another negative externality, if you will, of top-down command and control economies. The assumption is that the people in Washington, D.C., for example, know what to do. And the problem is they don't know what to do, okay? The production processes that go into something as simple as a pencil, okay? A piece of wood with lead in it, a little metal band, and some rubber. When you start breaking that down and you start looking at, okay, you need a forestry industry, okay? And there's all kinds of stuff that goes into that, okay? You need mining in order to get that lead or whatever that graphite is for the pencil. You need an entire industry and an entire chain of capital goods production and everything. The people that make the mining equipment and the people that make the hauling equipment, like the big trucks, and it just goes on and on and on. Okay. And then you got the people that make the little metal band. Well, okay. If you back into that, there's a whole mining industry, steel industry behind that. And the eraser, there's a whole rubber industry with all of its intermediate capital goods and things like that. And so no one person actually can know everything there is to know to build a pencil. This is why if I go drop you on a deserted island with $1 trillion, it's not like you feel like a trillionaire. This is why you feel like I got to get off this island and get back to civilization. The reason is because you can't make a pencil. Okay. I saw there's a thing online somewhere where a guy tried to build a toaster. He bought all the individual pieces and tried to make a toaster. And I think it worked like one time almost. He just couldn't make it. And he also spent like hundreds of dollars. Whereas I can go to Walmart right now and buy a toaster for like $15. I mean, it's hard to stress enough how important the structure, what we call structure of production, is to your standard of living. And command and control doesn't make that better. It makes it worse. Now, the only reason it's better in China is because, again, they have totalitarianism. I mean, I don't know if y'all realize this or not, but during COVID, rather than tell people you have to stay at home, they just came and welded people's doors shut in their own homes. You had people hanging out the window yelling about how they were starving in their own house. And here we are worried about 300-pound women not getting their food stamps, their SNAP benefits. This is a different culture, okay? In that culture, it's acceptable to weld somebody into their own home. I mean, you just can't, we're not going to have that in America. I mean, Washington, D.C. will be burned to the ground if that happens, okay? So that is just not even possible. Even if you think it's possible, I'm telling you, you're probably wrong, okay? Now, it might be possible 4 or 5 or 6 generations from now, which is why I say we need to get started now to roll this back before we lose all this rugged individualism and independence and respect for property and love of liberty and all that kind of stuff. Because 4, 5, 6 generations from now, if we can't roll this thing back, we are going to be China. Now, the good news is maybe we can produce a lot because we can just aim guns at people and tell them, hey, you're working in the factory. And aim a gun over here and say, hey, you're picking up trash. And aim a gun over here and say, hey, you're pouring concrete. Maybe we'll have a higher standard of living in some way, but we won't be free and we won't have our own property. So I don't know. That's a pretty big gamble. And I think that's one of the things Tom Bilyeu is trying to point to right here.
The same centralization that lets you move fast also guarantees that when you make a mistake, everyone goes down with you. Mao taught us all that lesson in the most terrifying fashion imaginable. 45 million people dead from policies that a moron could have told you were a terrible idea. But to tell him no was to be beaten to death, shot, starved, or exiled. And today, under Xi Jinping, China is relearning the same lesson, albeit more sophisticated. Ghost cities, a housing collapse, re-education camps, forced labor, and entrepreneurs vanishing simply for questioning the party. The founding fathers of America understood this danger all too well. That's why the US was founded on the ideal of freedom expressly because they had lived under tyranny and they knew just how bad and arbitrary it could get. But freedom, the free market, and democracy also have their trade-offs. And that's why we now have to make a choice. Do we embrace free market capitalism with all of its mess and chaos so that we can reap its never-ending innovation? Or, in order to catch up with China and make up for the mistakes of globalism, do we now begin copying China? We could go on for days with all.
Okay, the problem with this choice is it's not a good choice. The mistakes of globalism are caused. Globalism is just another example of what Mao did. Okay? It's not food, it's production. Okay? So globalism was a command and control decision, and it led to where it led. Now we're looking at it, it's no different than Mao making his decision and 45 million people dying and then the retrospect going, yeah, maybe that wasn't the right decision. Let's pass tariffs. I mean, that's kind of the Mao version of what we're doing to try to stop globalism. Donald Trump is saying, well, let's have some tariffs. That'll fix globalism. No, it won't fix globalism. More government will never fix any problem that we have in society. It just won't. It only makes it worse. Now, sometimes it takes years or decades for that worseness to show up. But eventually it does come because government tends to grow and it tends to become more totalitarian, and it tends to carry out its mission even if its mission is not having the right results. I mean, we saw this during COVID, right? How long did we wear masks, or we were told to wear masks? And everybody knew, like after the first 2 weeks, masks don't even work. But everywhere you went, people were telling you to put a mask on. So this is just an example of how long a command and control decision can persist, even when everybody knows it's wrong. This is why 45 million people died in China under Mao. This is why it's taken us 30 years to recognize that globalism is not working for Americans. What we should have done, okay, instead of globalize, is we should have got rid of unions. We should have gone back to the gold standard. You know, globalization didn't happen until we went off the gold standard. Okay, that's just a fact. We should have Instead of the Federal Registry getting bigger, we should have made it get smaller. Instead of arguing over whether the upper income tax rate was 39% or 36.7, we should have abolished the IRS and then gone to a tariff system then for all the revenue of the U.S. We should have been working our way out of the Social Security program. We should recognize that's not going to lead anywhere good, okay? But what did we do instead? We created Medicare. We created Medicaid. I mean, we just piled on. We just did more of the wrong things. And the only way to reverse this is to start peeling those things off, taking away the Social Security, taking away the Medicare, taking away all the regulations. You know, there's, I don't know, 150,000 pages or something in the Federal Registry. I mean, it's ridiculous. This is why you go to large companies and you see HR getting bigger, okay? You see the compliance department getting bigger. All these training videos you have to watch and all this stuff. It's all for compliance. People in Washington, D.C. pass these laws, and these companies, they just hire more HR people. They just hire more companies to create training videos and make all their employees watch. Meanwhile, they want their employees to sell more or produce more or whatever. It's an impossible path to stay on. I mean, if any of you work for a large corporation, you know what I'm talking about. Just every year, like my job, I'm externally focused, right? I'm supposed to talk to customers. I'm supposed to generate sales, things like this. But every year that goes by, there's more training videos that I have to watch. And these are for compliance reasons. There's more rules I have to adhere to through HR. There's just more stuff. And meanwhile, I'm trying to figure out, and they also want me to sell more. And it's like, well, how can I sell more if you give me all these other things to do? I mean, something's got to drop out, you know? And the problem is the government's on the side of a lot of those things. So those can't drop out. I mean, if they don't comply, they get fined and all kinds of bad things happen. So, all right, let's jump into clip number 2 for Tom and see what he has to say in this next section.
Not careful, we risk learning the wrong lesson. There's no doubt one must give the devil his due. What China has done since Mao's death has been nothing short of extraordinary. But as I go to great lengths to remind people, Deng Xiaoping, who replaced Mao, realized the catastrophe of Mao was in centralizing decision-making. Allowing one man to make all of the decisions for a country had led to mass murder and biblical levels of starvation. Ironically, Deng Xiaoping, the man responsible for China's true Great Leap Forward, looked at the devastation brought on by Mao's central planning and then looked at America, her free market, and the prosperity that it brought, and decided to copy that. That was the innovation that actually propelled China forward. Capitalism, the very thing America is in the process of abandoning in favor of a post-Deng Chinese model that, thanks to Xi Jinping, is headed back in the horrifying Mao direction. People forget the timeline. Beginning in 1978, Deng Xiaoping opened the economy to private markets, private enterprise, and foreign capital. And the results of that were seismic. And he did it by inviting Americans to come in and teach them about the American system. From creating thousands of banks and decentralizing loan applications to the structure of venture capital itself, they took it all in and replicated our model and our success, and in many ways, honestly, surpassed it.
All right. What I want to bring up here is China is very good at taking what's known and turbocharging it, let's say. Okay, they're very, very good at that. I remember years ago, I had some customers in the oil business, and they used to talk about what they were doing in China, and they said, it's funny, you go over there, and they'll buy anything from you, but they want you to show them how to do it. And so now we shouldn't be afraid of this. This is part of the problem I don't like or the thing I don't like about the intellectual property issues and things like that. What we've been doing, which is really hurting ourselves, I think, and I'll give some evidence of this, but what we've been doing is we'll say, hey, Vietnam, we'll trade with you, but you have to respect our IP laws, our intellectual property laws. And, you know, some of these countries go, okay, and they sign on the dotted line, right? But if you look at someone like Elon Musk, for example, Elon Musk says, here's how I'm building a Tesla. If you want to build one, go build it. He's confident that he'll invest more in capital and things like that, and he'll outproduce you. That's what he's confident of. But that's the way we need to be as a country. We need to be confident in our level of innovation, our level of free enterprise, free markets, property rights. These are all the things that lead to innovation. If you clamp down more on the American people with some sort of command and control. I know y'all have seen this before, but I mean, we saw this under Biden. He would roll out some policy and people were like rolling their eyes like, what the hell are these guys thinking? That's the way command and control economies are. Most people are sitting around going, why is this guy trying to tell us how to build a car? We know how to build a car. We just need him to get the hell out of the way. I mean, that's what people are thinking. They're not thinking, oh, this is brilliant. Joe Biden's going to tell us how to build a car. No. And so the fundamental problem is just too much government. And I know you probably listen to the show, and you're thinking, yeah, Seth, you always say that. You sound like a broken record. But it's true. It's true. You just have to look. You go back and watch The Men Who Made America, which there's some women that made America too. It's not just men. But look at what they did. They were free, okay? They saw some problem. Nobody showed up and said, well, you got to have a lawyer on staff, and you got to have a ramp up to your building, because we got to take care of, make sure the people that are in wheelchairs, can access your building. Nobody did anything like that. They just did it. They saw a need and they just did it. And the reason you need to have this, especially if you have a new idea, okay, is because you got to get to the money quickly. You got to get to customers buying from you quickly. If you're getting mired down in ADA regulations and OSHA regulations and this regulation and that regulation, all these regulations are an impediment to getting to the first customer. And what you need more than anything else when you start a business is you need revenue. Okay. You need sales. And that's why only the biggest that's why these guys get to a certain size and they just sell out to the majors. Because, to get up to the next level, a lot of times is just a huge investment and unless you have something that can go really fast, like a Facebook or an Amazon, unless you have something that's just a paradigm shifting kind of business, a lot of these guys just go, man, I'm done. I'm 55. I'm tired. I'm tired of fighting the government. I'm tired of fighting lawyers. I'm tired of fighting all these people. And they just sell out, sell out to some big company. And then what you have is like one day you wake up and 10 companies own all the food businesses or whatever. So it's all part of the same problem. But we run around. I mean, I think the challenge for us individually and voters individually is we run around and we notice the symptoms. And we try to advocate for politicians to treat the symptoms. But you got to go further. You got to go below that first order to the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth order level to find the principle, the underlying principle that's really causing the causality of these problems. And we just don't see that in our politics. Our politics are just dumb. And the only thing the only solution I can come up with is it's just got to go away. It's just got to be throttled way back. Instead of it going from 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 to 9 trillion, it needs to go in the opposite direction. 9, 8, 7, 6, all the way back to, 100 billion if we could get it there. And then it has no power over us to do any of those things. I see something needs to be done. I go, I think I can do a business. I think I can create a business on that. And I just do it. I don't have to go ask OSHA. I don't have to ask about lawyers or ADA or, the Americans for Disability Act. I don't have to comply with any of these things because they don't exist anymore. So that's where we need to be. More of asking Donald Trump to help us figure out what the problem is a big part of the problem.
But make no mistake, Deng's reforms came with strings. The Communist Party never relinquished ultimate political control. The state kept the levers of credit, land policy, and licensing. It would let private enterprises grow until it looked like private enterprise might grow into a rival. Fast forward to Xi Jinping. He inherited a nation far wealthier than Deng could have ever imagined, and he had learned the lesson of Russia's collapse, and so Xi set out to prevent that from happening in China. He understood that once people begin questioning the party, stability weakens, and he was not going to let that happen in China. His tool set was blunt and comprehensive, an expansive anti-corruption drive that purged anyone who wasn't loyal and ensured corporations cooperated with the party. Hundreds of thousands of officials gone, and a regulatory offensive that installed party officials into even the most successful and powerful private firms. He rewired party oversight into corporate boardrooms everywhere and made clear who ultimately decides the rules. That's the danger of a system built on authoritarianism and not freedom. When entrepreneurs publicly challenged the system, or even just sounded too independent, the state responded aggressively. The most famous example was Jack Ma, one of the world's richest and most successful men. On the eve of Ant Group's $37 billion IPO, Jack Ma made the fatal error of criticizing bank regulators. The IPO was instantly halted, and Jack Ma was essentially kidnapped and re-educated. Ma's public disappearance and Ant's enforced restructuring served as a vicious warning to the entire entrepreneurial class. Companies were told to align with state priorities or face severe consequences. Fines, restructuring, and re-education were all on the menu. These moves were not subtle. They conveyed an unmistakable message. The party will allow markets only to the extent markets remain politically useful. The government also allowed, and in many cases engineered, huge economic bubbles, most famously in real estate.
All right, before we get into the real estate bubble, what China really is, it's more akin to fascism. Okay? It's kind of a combination of fascism and communism. In some cases, they just outright own the means of production. Okay, so like oil companies, energy companies like whatever the Chinese energy company is. When you look at China, there's hundreds and hundreds of companies that the government straight up owns, and they let cronies run it. Okay, but the government owns it. And what Tom is saying here is absolutely true. What they do to control the companies is they put Communist Party officials on the board, okay, on the board of directors, and pay them money. Some of these guys are rich because they're on these boards, and they don't do anything. They just bark out orders and make sure that whatever the company's doing is in line with the political apparatus that is Xi Jinping's government. And we just don't want, for one thing, once you have that, you can never get rid of it. I mean, you just never get rid of it. Jack Ma, good Lord. I remember when that happened, and that is unbelievable. Can you imagine somebody just kidnapping Elon Musk? If anybody, I'm saying this tongue in cheek, okay? But if anybody ever needed re-education in America after being in American government, it's Elon Musk, right? I mean, he was in there doing things, and there are people in government going, dude, we need to take you over here and show you how this is done. You obviously don't know that you're working in government. I mean, in some people's minds, he desperately needed re-education, right? Because he was doing it, he was disrupting everything, and people were not happy about that. But that's my point, though, is once you settle into that kind of arrangement, you're never going to get rid of it. You're just never going to get rid of it. It's entrenched, and it has its own interest. And those are very hard to drive wedges into. People build up alliances and all kinds of things around politics that it just doesn't respond to the same kinds of incentives that employees respond to, or workers, or whatever, or even corporations that are owned by shareholders. Yeah, the instruments are blunt, man. I mean, just think about what happened there. Can you imagine some guys show up in maybe some dark suits, and they say, hey, we're your new board members. Show us where we sit down. And if anybody objects, so they just disappear them, We don't need that in America. We don't want that in America. Nobody today wants that in America. And so this is just not, in my mind, a viable choice. But the exercise that Tom Bilyeu has taken us through is very, very valuable because a lot of people don't know this history. They don't understand. They look at China and they think, yeah, it's pretty good. But then I tell people, hey, they welded people into their own apartments and they were starving during COVID. I mean, what is that? That's whatever that is, it ain't American. Okay. All right, let's jump back into this.
For years, local governments relied on land sales for economic progress, and developers were incentivized to borrow cheaply, ultimately building entire ghost cities on speculative demand to please Xi. The model blew up spectacularly when credit tightened and buyers began to balk. That led to the 2021 collapse of Evergrande, a company with roughly $300 billion in liabilities at its peak. That failure exposed just how leveraged and brittle China's property economy had become. And the fallout was immediate. Frozen projects, distressed homeowners, and a contagion of developer failures that punctured confidence in that growth model. The state has since tried to manage the damage, but the era of easy finance growth is clearly over because markets operate on physics now.
All right. This is kind of just another example of what they talked about with Mao, where 45 million people starved. These command and control things, they always end in this spectacular collapse. It just so happened like Mao's spectacular collapse ended in the collapse of 45 million people's lives. But today we don't so much have that. It's still possible. Look at what's happening with our tariffs in China. We picked a fight with China, and now all these people that grow soybeans, there's no market for soybeans. No, they can't sell their soybeans. Something like China was buying something like 40% of all the soybeans or something in the world. And now all of a sudden we have no market for soybeans. And so this is going to take time. These guys are going to have to figure out something else to plant. It takes a whole season to grow that stuff and then harvest it and then take it to market. And who knows what they're going to be able to switch it to. Is Donald Trump going to be able to tell them, hey, you need to grow more asparagus or corn or radishes or peanuts or whatever? I mean, he doesn't know. He doesn't know what to produce. And so you still have, even though we don't open up the paper or whatever and see 45 million people dying, we do see still these spectacular kind of failures. They tend to be financial in nature. They tend to disrupt some particular industry that gets, let's say like the solar industry is heavily subsidized and all of a sudden the subsidies go away and you start, like 3 or 4 or 5 million people start losing their jobs, I mean, it just wrecks a bunch of people's lives. And so the failures are the same. They're similar. They're not exactly the same, but they're caused by the same miscalculation. And this is why you have free markets, because free markets, I don't fully understand. Nobody really does, but the free markets don't make those kinds of mistakes. I know they get blamed all the time. Oh, well, this was a failure of free market capitalism. That's why the regulators need to do this. And that. All that is bullshit. Okay. None of that shit is true. It's just it's more propaganda, okay? If you really dug into this, and you're just going to have to trust me, if you really dug into this, you would see all of that is false, okay? That's just not how the world works. But that's how people have been told the world works that way. And so now they believe it. They hear it enough, and they internalize it. And now it becomes the part of what they think. All right, let's jump into the next clip here.
Now, there are moral costs as well. Alongside economic control, the party has deployed coercive measures against minorities, most notoriously in Xinjiang, where re-education camps and mass detentions have drawn international condemnation and documented human rights abuses. The same political machinery that builds super-fast rail and industrial capacity is also capable of mass lockdowns, mass coercion, and what some have called concentration camps for the Uyghurs. That duality, breathtaking development on one hand and brutal repression on the other, is the devil's bargain of a command economy. The thing people always seem to lose sight of is the fact that when you're telling people what to do and how to do it, eventually someone is going to disagree. In a free country, you have to convince them. You have to use persuasion. In an authoritarian system, you just use guns. And in the end, boys and girls, the guns always come out. So when choosing that system, you are choosing violence. So when America looks at that system and swoons, every alarm bell I have goes off. China imitating elements of the free market, that made sense. But here's the playbook we'd be copying if we decide to ape China now.
Okay, he's right. You know, China copying America makes sense. I mean, you can keep, because if you think about it, if you have total totalitarianism and you sprinkle in a little bit of freedom, and then when it gets a little too free, you clamp down and you send Jack Ma to a re-education camp. Things go in that direction, but they don't go in the other direction. More command and control does not create China. What creates China is massive totalitarianism and force and death and destruction. And then when you sprinkle a little freedom in there, oh my gosh, people embrace it. They start taking advantage of it. It's like Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Same thing. They had no freedom. Okay. You started sprinkling some freedom in there. People's standard of living started to come up. They started to produce more. So it works in that direction. You can always go from totalitarianism toward freedom. And think of that as a train moving in some direction. Let's say the train starts at totalitarianism and travels toward freedom. That direction is always okay because it just gets better the further you go to freedom. But in the other direction, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't produce more. It just gets worse and worse until you hit rock bottom. It's like an alcoholic. You don't have a problem. I'm managing it well. And you just keep going and going and going until you hit rock bottom. And then you start drinking less or maybe not drinking at all. And all of a sudden your life starts to get better. It's the same kind of concept. So I just reject out of whole cloth that America trying to embrace a command and control economy like China has is never going to work. We should not pursue that. It will not work. It will be a waste of time, money, resources, and people's wealth. And a whole lot of people are going to be really bad off if we pursue that. All right, let's jump into the next part here.
Step 1, centralize political power. Step 2, embed the government inside of companies by buying up state-owned shares. Step 3, drive enormous gains in output, incomes, and capacity for a chosen set of winners. Step 4, when private power threatens political control, or when speculative bubbles form, or when people just disagree, step in with force. The result is a system where market incentives run on an authoritarian chassis. It produces the kind of scale and speed that democracies can only envy, and I get why it's seductive, but boy, oh boy, does it have a downside. But despite that, I think this decision...
But see, it doesn't. That's the thing. He's asserting, I guess maybe I'm asserting too, but I could make a case that it doesn't produce more, okay? It's easy to look at China and say, wow, they're producing more, okay? I'm not going to go into it again. I just went into it. But that's not, having more command and control is not what's producing more. It's the freedom inside of that culture that's used to the command and control that's producing more. We already have freedom, but we're losing it, okay? So this only goes in the negative direction. We have to have less command and control. We have to have less regulation. I guess the right word is fewer, actually. We have to have fewer laws, I would say administrative laws. You know what kind of laws we need? Don't murder, the 10 Commandments. Don't murder, don't rape, don't steal. Laws that have victims, crimes that have victims, those things should be against the law. All these other things, these are just things that muck up the system. It's like throwing sand in the gears of this massive production system that just produces so much wealth and everything. And every time you create a law, like an administrative law, you just throw sand in the gears. And you can have all the great intentions of the entire world. Like, I think Donald Trump does have a lot of intentions, good intentions. But I think he's listening to people that don't really understand what the hell they're talking about. And I know Bob Lighthizer looks like he knows what he's talking about. But I don't know, man. I'm just not seeing it. To me, a tariff is a force. Now, tariffs are better than an income tax, but that's not the choice we're being given. It's like we keep the income tax, but then we also have tariffs. And to me, both is not better than, I mean, we should just have either no tariffs. We shouldn't have income tax. Tariffs are much better. But tariffs are only good if you could get rid of the income tax. There's no way in which you could say the income tax, we have an income tax, and so we're going to have a tariff because of globalism, and that's going to make us wealthier. No, that's wrong. And so, unfortunately, these things are going to have to play out, and we're going to have to see how they do. And the other unfortunate thing is, for us Republicans out there, Donald Trump has an R by his name, and this is not going to end well for Republicans. And I don't know. I'm not being anti-MAGA or anything like that. I'm just telling you the way it is. Government, the Democrats have their things and the Republicans have their things, but government in general is just not the solution. All right, let's see what he's got a little bit more here and then we'll wrap up.
Is a lot harder than I'm making it sound, because history has proven in times of crisis, even America, the land of the free, has set freedom aside and folded under something approaching a temporary dictatorship.
See this shirt? It's currently a top seller.
Okay, let me just say right here that if Japan bombed Pearl Harbor tomorrow, we could not do what we did on December 8th, 1941. That option is not available to America. Okay, we just don't have that productive capacity. And so to say, and Tom Bilyeu's not advocating for this in any way, but he's saying there's a choice there. But to advocate for command and control when you don't even have the basis. See, look at what Xi Jinping did, okay? What he did, or Dang, or whatever his name is, what he did is when they had nothing, they were all toiling around in the dirt, okay? He came in and he sprinkled freedom on top. Okay. Freedom is a popular idea, by the way. He didn't have to run around the countryside and sell the Chinese people on this. He just lifted controls and they were like, oh, wow, we're actually free now. This is cool. Let's invent something. Let's produce something. Let's improve our lives by making furniture and selling it to our neighbors or whatever they did. Okay. So he sprinkled freedom and he lifted the burden of government. That's what he did. And China just got freer and freer and freer. And then President Xi comes in at some point. He says, hold on a second here. We're starting to get a little too much freedom. Okay. And he famously kidnaps Jack Ma, sends him to a re-education camp, starts to put Communist Party members on boards of directors of all the major companies. And he makes it really clear that, okay, you guys have gotten all the freedom you're going to get. There's no more freedom here. You're going to have to live with the level of freedom you have right now. And maybe even a little less. Okay. I had to re-record this show because of a technical difficulty with the mic that I didn't know until after the show was done. But one of the things I mentioned in the show is there's a great book called Chip War. And I forgot the author, but Chip War is about the microchip business. And of course, that was in the news a lot here a while back. But one of the things that was interesting about Chip War is there's this ecosystem, okay? So there's like there's like companies that are really good at the lithography part, which is where you use optics and things like that to superimpose the integrated circuit on a substrate. And then you take that substrate and you etch it away with these chemicals, and that's what creates a microchip, right? So there's like this company called ASML that's really good at the lithography. And then you got NVIDIA, which is really good at these GPUs. And you got Intel that makes good chips, but they can only be used on computers. They can't be used on iPhones. And anyway, China has been trying to separate itself from this ecosystem, okay? It's been trying to be an island and not need ASML and not need NVIDIA and not need some of these other companies, not need Taiwan Semiconductor. And in the book, it's really interesting because what they talk about is they have not been able to do it. it's not that they don't have the technology. They've stolen the technology. They implement the technology. In many cases, the government just outright bought they made the investments and gave it to the companies to run. But what happened was, because they have such a political type of system, all these regions of the country wanted, well, I want that, and I want that. And everybody wanted it in their territory, kind of like the way the military industrial complex is. I don't know if you know this or not, but one of the reasons we can't get rid of this military industrial complex is because every senator and every congressman has something in their territories. What these companies have done, like Raytheon, is they've distributed their businesses throughout the 50 states and made it impossible politically to curb back their production. Because what happens is, every time the government starts talking about trimming Raytheon back, Raytheon, starts talking about, oh, they're getting rid of 3,000 jobs in Central Texas, or they're getting rid of 4,000 jobs in Northern California, or whatever, And so this is the same problem China has, okay? Except it kind of gets in the way of them of being this island. They want to extricate themselves from the ecosystem that is the chip business. And they just have not been able to do it. And I thought that was so interesting. And this all has to do with government. This all has to do with politics. It doesn't have anything to do with people in China aren't smart enough. They're plenty smart. They absolutely could do it if they could get their damn government out of the way. And this is where we're headed. If we can't get our government out of the way, we're going to lose our innovation. We're going to lose our standard of living. We're going to go backwards in a big way. And so with that, I think I'm going to wrap up the show. Man, thanks guys for coming in. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate you watching and listening. Some of you are listening on your podcast, your podcatcher, and some of you are watching on YouTube. Go to YouTube. It's under Who Gets to Decide. So if you just search on Who Gets to Decide, you should come across my videos. And mainly I'm doing this because the algorithm on YouTube, it tends to work. Most people are watching videos. That's just a fact. They're not listening in their cars. Most people are bebopping around to music or something, not listening to their podcast and telling their friends, sending their friends links to podcasts. Some are. I mean, I appreciate those of you that are doing that, and keep doing it by all means. And also, go into the YouTube and put some comments down. If you disagree with what I'm saying, or you got some points to make, or maybe something I left out even, go into the comments section and make note of that. And because I do read the comments, and so I appreciate that feedback. All right, everybody, with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the show. Thanks for coming in. Thanks for listening. Come back in a couple more days. We'll have a new episode for you on Who Gets to Decide. All right, peace.